Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kanav Dhir from VirdSense. I'm a product manager here. I lead a lot of our product efforts from the hardware and software side, and I'm going to talk to you about how VirdSense is helping solve a lot of the questions of today we have of our spaces, around how the spaces are being used, and also preparing us to solve a lot of the questions we're going to have tomorrow. So we all know the transformation that's happening in our industry, right? So there's $1 trillion asset class. We have millions of square foot in our corporations, and the way this real estate is being used is completely changing. We have more dynamic workplaces. It's not individual offices anymore. We're designing spaces to be used for interaction. And with all of these changes, we need a way to understand how these spaces are being used. There's some data that shows that with co-working spaces, the day-old 200 square foot per person is now going all the way down to 75 square foot per employee. That's a big change, and we need to understand, how it's being used and what can we do about it. The industry has a problem. There's a lot of different types of data sources available, and they're disparate, they're complex, they're not fit for purpose. We have manual surveys, which are actually really insightful data, but they're infrequent, they're costly. Then we have a lot of companies spending a lot of money on Wi-Fi data, badge data, and they're trying to, eat soup with a fork. They're just trying to understand how spaces are being used from data that's not meant for that. And then there's data that's related to low quality sensors and trying to use sensors that are designed to turn on lights to understand how my space is actually being used. So at VirdSense, we're designing sensors that allow customers to get the power of computer vision, a technology that's made accessible, responsible, and relevant for understanding how spaces are being used. This technology is 100% wireless. It can be deployed in minutes. It uses a cellular backhaul, so bringing low IT friction. And the data itself is 98, 99% accurate and 100% anonymous. And we're able to do a lot more with it than we would think. So VirdSense, one of the main models that VirdSense has deployed, the main kind of value that we're bringing to customers is around people counting. So with the single sensor over a pod of desks, around 6 to 8 desks, we're able to get not just occupancy, but person count down to the desk level. We're also able to deploy the same sensors in any space, whether it's a soft seating area, cafeteria, lounge, and we're able to get a person count for that space and even spatial awareness of where in that space people are. Here's an example of a new model that we deployed with a customer. So a customer is using VirdSense sensors to understand how their space is being used for several months. And they actually brought in CBRE to do a manual survey during the time VirdSense was there. And there was two purposes of this. One was to make sure VirdSense was working. And we found that VirdSense was actually, with a double-blind test, 99% accurate. The other was to understand, are there data usage that the data is not able to collect? Are there things and the ways people are using the space that we're just not able to measure? And one really interesting insight that they found was 25% of desks and 10% of conference room usage was passive, meaning no one was there, but they're not available for people to use. So with this customer, with the same exact sensors they were using for person count, because they're powered by computer vision, we deployed a new model that allowed them to not just get a person count per space, but also understand if there's signs of life. So both from a historical analysis perspective, they can understand what percentage of usage is falling within this criteria so they can make behavioral changes. But in a real-time perspective, for live addressing, for real-time understanding of what's available, they're able to not lose out on occupant experience by sending people to a place that may not have people in it, but is still not available for them to use. These are just some of the beginnings of what customers are able to do with our sensors. We have customers that are working with us and figuring out, for facilities use cases, can you identify how messy a space is? How much has it changed? So I can actually prioritize which spaces to and to not clean, rather than having a cleaning service go out every single day. We have customers that are spending millions of dollars designing furniture and spaces designed for collaboration, and they want to measure, is it actually being used for what we're spending money on? So we're working with a customer to design a model that can actually put a collaboration score on these meetings, these interactions. Are people interacting? Are they using the space for individual work? Should we be designing different types of spaces? And then anything from customer occupants using spaces that are probably not designed to be used, taking phone calls, and even down to, does the water jug need to be refilled? All of that is possible with AI. AI allows us to have the power of not just what we can detect today, but be able to expand that possibility into what we're able to detect tomorrow. I'm going to share a couple of interesting data elements with you now that we have a lot of customers, Fortune 1000s that have generated really valuable and accurate person count data. So across these companies, these 10 companies, around 6 months of data we pulled, 44% of meetings were one-person meetings, regardless of conference room size. 34% of meetings were two-person meetings. And only 22% of the meetings that we saw were 3 people or more. We all know there's a right sizing problem, but being able to quantify it and attack it from actually how big the problem is pretty important data. We also did the same thing and understood a new trend of space, which is unbookable conference rooms. How are these performing? So we found that unbookable conference rooms, collaboration rooms essentially, are being used 73% of the time by one person, 20% of the time by 2 people, and 6% of the time by 3 or more people. This is very insightful because while unbookable spaces are significantly higher utilized than bookable conference rooms, because you don't have ghost meetings, you don't have squatters, what you have to do is you have to design the space to account for the types of usage of these spaces. They should have less square footage allocated to them because this is how occupants are using it. There's some more very interesting data that we're starting to pull and see. I actually found this to be pretty interesting. For bookable conference rooms, we found that the most common meeting size was 30 minutes. And this is along the lines of what you'd expect. But for unbookable conference rooms, because we're measuring person count and actually have this data, reliable data, we saw that meetings were 10 minutes long, most common. So maybe we should be using this to design for better, more comfortable furniture for short stays, for standing meetings, etc. So the last thing I'll leave you with is, with the power of computer vision, we're not only able to answer your question of today, which is how are spaces being utilized? What are people doing? What is the employee experience? How can we improve it? But you can invest in an appreciating asset instead of a depreciating hardware device that can actually answer your questions of tomorrow. Thank you.